Hey folks, this is the Netgear Wi-Fi 6E quad band Orbi network system that I have picked up. This is the 3-pack. I've purchased the black because it was at a really good deal, although it is also available to get in white. I do want to stress that I still purchased it myself. I have not been in contact with Netgear. This is not a sponsored video. I will be giving you my honest thoughts. I am really going to be holding it to a high standard. Now, let's be clear here, Netgear are not marketing this system as any kind of enterprise network. This is still aimed at the home network market, but it is clearly positioned at the very top of that market in terms of the features offered. As I say, I am expecting peak performance here. The good news is I think I have the perfect house to test this in because our home was built in the early 1700s. It is centuries old, and as such, the builders and designers at the time gave no consideration, how selfish of them, to good Wi-Fi signals, and there are no drywalls, plasterboards or anything like that inside the internal structure of our property. In fact, some of these walls are solid brick and multiple feet in thickness. I am recording this video in a completely separate building from the main property, which is where I also need to get good internet access to as well. Now, for the last couple of years, we have been using a Linksys Velop Mesh Wi-Fi network, which is limited to Wi-Fi 5. And with more and more devices now coming into our home with Wi-Fi 6E technology, I really want to be able to have us make use of that. But even so, there are other Wi-Fi mesh systems such as Google Nest amongst others that are offering Wi-Fi 6E at a fraction of the cost of this Orbi network. So we will be going through all of the additional features that are given here, but let's have a quick start with the unboxing. And inside the package, Netgear have kept things very simple for us. We have this plain white box which houses the plugs and adapters that's going to power our hardware. There is a single LAN cable provided which is going to connect the main router to the internet source in our home. And then we have the 3 main mesh hubs which include that router, okay? And this router has a 10 gigabyte internet connection port on it. So if you are spending this amount of money, the chances are you are not going to need to upgrade it for many years to come. There is also a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connection and 3 gigabit Ethernet connections for a total of 4. And on the bottom of the router, we have the mounting holes. I have also, by the way, picked up a couple of these mounting brackets from Netgear. These are optional, but if you want a wall mount, then you'll need something like this. And next up, we have the 2 satellites. And the only real difference here is they don't have that internet port. They do still have the 2.5 gigabit LAN connection, as well as the 3 gigabit LAN connections for a total of 4 each. Now, the satellites and the router are all packing 12 antennas each, so should really be able to give out a good Wi-Fi connection. And there is also a sync button as well on each one. As well as those physical LAN connections, this is a quad band system, and it's the only quad band system I know of in the home mesh networking market, and that's because there is the 2.4 gigahertz connection, 2 5 gigahertz connections, and the dedicated 6 gigahertz connection for your Wi-Fi 6E devices. Now, what makes quad band so special is that of those 2 5 gigahertz radio bands, one of those is set aside and is dedicated solely for these mesh hubs to talk to one another. So none of your devices will connect to that particular 5 gigahertz band, and that frees up the traffic so that the other bands are solely used for your devices and gives you the strongest possible connection throughout your home. In terms of the absolute theoretical maximum speeds through Wi-Fi, on the 2.4 gigahertz network, you are looking at 1200 megabits per second. And on the 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz radio bands, there is a maximum possible throughput of 2400 megabits per second. So I'm really excited now to getting this mesh network set up. I'm going to be pushing it really hard through its paces, seeing what sort of performance we can get out of it, and I hope the rest of this video is also going to be helpful to you folks. So let's get on with it. So this is the room here by the front door of the house. This is where the internet fibre terminates, and so where the router is going to be connected. So I've got everything turned on. I have downloaded the Orbi app, and I have had to sign up for a free Netgear account. And the setup process, all credit to Netgear, it has been a very simple one. One little issue was that Orbi did not detect my internet immediately, but that's because I have to put in an account from my ISP, which it doesn't give you the option to do that until it fails to detect the internet. But once I'd sorted that, the rest of the process was an easy one. It automatically detects both satellites and then updates the firmware for the satellites and the router. The only annoying thing was that it did not update the firmware all in one go, so I had to repeat that process a few times in order to get everything fully up to date. Right, so I've completed the setup process, which I'll be honest, there was a few issues getting through that, so it did kind of take all day, which is a bit annoying. But I think we're all good to go now. So here we have the main router set up, and I've got it wall mounted also. This is the ONT, the optical network terminal. This is where internet comes into our home. The fibre connection finishes here. And then we have the LAN cable connecting the ONT to the router itself. And right next to the router, you can see on my phone here, if I do a speed test, we have a gigabit internet connection. There we go. Getting about 600 to 700 megabits per second over the Wi-Fi, which is not too bad at all. And I mentioned I had a couple of niggles through setup, one of those being that these devices are actually too powerful. And the problem was, even when I take you to where the first satellite is positioned, which has brick walls in the way between that satellite and the main router here that it's connected to, the Wi-Fi was overlapping. And so when I was connecting phones and even computers over the wireless, they were getting confused as to which one to connect to. And I would find that the Wi-Fi would drop. It was a really annoying problem. It took me a few hours to figure out. But one of the things that you can actually do is reduce the transmittable power of the Wi-Fi, which I've done, reduced it by 50%. And what that allows is for those devices to actually fixate on a particular router or satellite and to stay connected to that particular device. So I now do have all three nodes in use and functioning correctly. We have the main router that is connected by the front door. That's where the internet connects into our home. And from there, a couple of rooms over in the main living area is where we have the first satellite. And I did connect that through the wired backhaul because I already had that Ethernet cable in place from a previous network system. And interestingly, over a wireless backhaul, so that's where the satellite is connecting to the main router via that dedicated 5 gigahertz network, I did experiment by trying that, and I still got a connection, which is something I've never done before with a previous mesh network. It never reaches through those stone walls. So the fact I even managed to get a wireless backhaul connection was something I was very surprised about. However, the speeds were a little bit lower than the wired backhaul, as you might expect, and devices that connected to the satellite whilst it was on wireless backhaul were able to get connection speeds of about 300 to 400 megabits per second. So still very impressive, but obviously, ultimately, I'm going for that wired backhaul connection. And then the second satellite is stored in the garage, which, as I mentioned, is a completely separate building to the main property. So yeah, for this, I also have a wired backhaul connection with a Category 6 all weatherproof cable. I did try this over wireless backhaul, but it wasn't detecting the satellite at all in that situation. It is just too far from the router with too many walls in the way. But over wired backhaul, again, I'm getting a fantastic connection of about 700 megabits per second over Wi-Fi. And my computer, which is connected directly into this satellite via a LAN cable, is getting my full internet speeds of about 940 megabits per second. And I would definitely say that the Orbi is a vast improvement over my previous Wi-Fi 5 mesh network. On my previous system, we actually had 6 nodes around the place in order to make sure that we had complete coverage. But of course, in this case, we've only got 3, and that seems more than sufficient. In fact, as I mentioned, even with just 3, I had to reduce the amount of transmittable power from the Wi-Fi because there was just too much of it. A little bit like having to turn the audio down when sound is too high in your headphones and you get that crackling noise. I think that was the situation here. But reducing that to 50% has just meant that we now get a good, seamless connection. Now, in terms of the network itself, Well, Orbi provides you with 4 different networks to connect to. So you have your main network, which includes the 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and the 6 gigahertz bands. So that network will provide the best possible connection to each device and whatever the device is capable of using. So if you don't have a Wi-Fi 6E device, that won't be connecting to the 6 gigahertz band, but it can still connect to the best of the other 2. One limitation, which seems kind of unnecessary, is that you cannot separate those Wi-Fi bands into their own SSIDs, which means if you know, for example, that you only want a device to connect to the 2.4 gigahertz band, unfortunately, you can't make that choice and you are left to the device and the Orbi system to decide that for you. However, there is a dedicated network that is useful for smart devices, so that includes things such as smart plugs, smart lights, smart bulbs, alarm systems, things that generally will only connect to a 2.4 gigahertz network. You can dump all those on a separate network that Orbi will allow you to use, and you can set that network to only transmit a 2.4 gigahertz band. In all honesty, I didn't really care about that feature when I heard about it, but it has come in useful and we've been using it. It's nice to be able to dump all of our smart plugs and devices onto that network so we can keep them out of the attached devices on the main network when it comes to troubleshooting and what have you. In other words, it just keeps things clean, tidy and organised. The third network is your guest network. Most routers nowadays provide this option. And finally, there is also a dedicated Wi-Fi 6E network. Personally, I haven't used this yet because I don't see the point in having to limit myself to only using Wi-Fi 6E on devices that support it when the main network here also allows for them to connect to Wi-Fi 6E. But hey, I'm sure that will be a great feature for those of you that do have a use case scenario for that. The Netgear Orbi app, apart from being used for the initial setup process, has some fairly useful information on an ongoing basis. It allows you to see at an instant whether or not your internet is online. It allows you to see whether your satellites are connected and in what order they are connected to the main router. You can see your attached devices and have a play about with your Wi-Fi security. However, if you do need to make any in-depth or technical changes to your network, then you will need to use a browser on a computer, which utilises the same Netgear interface we've been using for over a decade at this point, which is fine, it's functional. However, there does seem to be less options here than with previous Netgear routers that I've used, so I'm not sure why that is. But you are able to use port forwarding from this interface. You can set up a VPN if you wish to do so. You can disable various features if you don't need them, and that may increase the overall stability of the network. And yep, it is just worth going through. There's a few features you might want to fanny about with just to get some better results. Oh, and one thing I did during initial setup was make sure that the network name and password were identical to what they were on our previous network setup. That way, all of the devices that we had connected will connect again automatically without having to put in passwords again. So in conclusion, do I think that the Netgear Orbi Wi-Fi 6 mesh network is worth the vast amounts of money that's being asked for it? And my answer would be, for most people, probably not, if I'm honest. Okay, I think this system is just way overkill for the majority of homes. In fact, even for us, with all of our thick brick masonry walls, we probably would have got away with just the 2-node setup if it wasn't for the fact that we have this separate outbuilding garage that we need to get internet access into as well. But even with that first satellite in our house turned off, with the transmit power ramped up to 100%, we can still get Wi-Fi everywhere, all over the property, even though it's a little bit weaker in some areas. So even I could have potentially got away with just getting the 2-node setup. And at the end of the day, networking can often be a nightmarish situation to get right. And unfortunately, I don't think the Orbi system really improves in that regard. It still does require quite a bit of tinkering to get it exactly how you want it. But ultimately, I think you need to ask yourself if you really need the additional features that are putting the price up so much, including the 10 gigabit internet port. Do you have 10 gigabit internet access? Do you need 2.5 gigabit LAN connections? Do you even need Wi-Fi 6E at this particular point in time? Still not many devices support that. And even though for me at the moment we're not making the most of the quad band technology here because of the fact that both of our satellites are connected over wired backhaul, we are actually building another shed down in the garden where we need internet access, and the plan is to have that connect over wireless backhaul, so that's when that will really come in useful for us. Although I'm not yet convinced about purchasing another satellite, I think we can play about with the 3 that we've got and extend the network even further just with this setup. But ultimately the Orbi 6E system, whilst definitely the cream of the crop in terms of consumer networking, I still feel could have done more for the price that's being asked for. Netgear Armour, parental controls, extra additional subscriptions that I think they really could have included to some degree here. Yes, there's a couple of free trials, but they only last about a month or so and are only really there to persuade you to spend more money. I also don't think it came with the best settings out of the box. Having transmit power defaulted to 100%, I think that's going to throw a lot of people off. In conclusion, certainly the Netgear Orbi system absolutely does offer some features that you simply cannot find in other competing mesh systems. However, I just think that for most consumers, a lot of those features aren't yet relevant, and by the time they do become relevant, the cost of them is probably going to be a lot less. But ultimately, if you feel that the quad band technology here is going to provide a vast improvement for you, or that you need that 10 gigabit internet port or the high-speed LAN ports amongst some of those other things, then absolutely you are not going to find them anywhere else. So the hardware is super powerful, let down unfortunately by the lackluster software. I would also strongly consider whether you really think you need to start off with 3 devices here, or if 1 router and 1 satellite may be sufficient to get going. But this has been my review for the Netgear Orbi Wi-Fi 6E mesh system. I hope it helps. If it has, please don't forget to drop a like on this video and subscribe for future hardware reviews going forward. Have a great day. I'll see you next time.